and welcome. My name is Roger Smith and this is my video on creating a scene on my model railroad. My model railroad is HO scale narrow gauge. It is my representation of the Silverton Northern Line out of Silverton, Colorado as it might have been. What I'm hoping to accomplish is a representation of this photo of the Silver Lake Mill Complex as located north of Silverton. My focus will be on the thought process as well as the modeling. I have been working on the Silverton section of the layout for some time now. My goal has been to add as much reality as I can to create a scene to capture the flavor of how it may have looked. When doing model railroads, there are always limitations and compromises, and that is some of what I want to cover in this video. This is the area where the scene will go. It's in a 67-inch wide by 43-inch deep space. It's in a U-shaped section of my house's foundation. Ironically, the house was being built the time the tracks were being laid to Silverton. The first thing I did was try to get a feel for the positioning and elevations of the structures and hills to figure out what elements of the scene would fit in the available space. I had started the construction of the ore bin some time ago, as well as a mock-up of the mill structure, and those were a good starting point. One thing I knew going into creating this scene was that it would need to be a mirror image of reality. This is something I did for the town of Silverton, and being able to create mirror images of photos on your computer is a great help. Another thing I saw early on was that there would not be room for 4 siding tracks as in the prototype, so I had to settle for 2. Also, the scene would need to be compressed, so trying to keep the illusion of depth using the space available would be a challenge. As I studied the scene, I didn't think the mock-up of the mill was imposing enough. I wanted that building to dominate the scene, so that would need to be changed. The mock-up gave me a feel for how high the hills should be, and the ratio of the painted terrain versus the amount of sky. I also needed to take into account of how to model the Animas River that would be near the foreground and how the river enters and exits the scene. Throughout this whole process, I tried to start from the rear of the area and work my way towards the front as I built the scene. The first thing was to paint the sky. I highly recommend Darryl Huffman's videos on backdrop painting. I've included a link in the description for these excellent videos. The main thing with the sky is to paint the top third the base color you want. Then add some white paint to the base color for the middle third and more white for the bottom third. I used 3 old ice cream containers with each shade and some cheap paint brushes. I painted the section of the top third and then progressed downward while the paint was still wet, so the transitions blended in, trying not to make it look too uniform, channeling my inner Bob Ross. At this time, I created a new mock-up of the mill. I tried to capture the flavor of the structure and focusing on the key elements. The width helps make it more imposing on the scene. I made the mock-up out in my workshop using MDF and thin plywood. At the time, I thought it'd be a mock-up and I would build a higher fidelity structure later. As it ended up, this became the base for the final building, as you will see in a bit. I added siding and windows and was pleased with the result. I may replace it sometime down the road, but for now it works for me and I'm focusing on other areas of the layout. Next up was roughing in the hills using cardboard strips and tacking them in with hot glue. Then plaster cloth was laid over the cardboard strips. A quick note, I got the plaster cloth from Dick Blick. I found I could get quite a bit of the stuff for a reasonable price. They have a 20-pound box for about $61, and that has lasted me a long time. The next step was to apply rock castings. While I have some commercially made rock molds, I'm not a fan of them. Some time ago, I made molds myself using layers of liquid latex and gauze applied over rocks we had collected on trips. They give a much wider variety, and I found the flatter molds work the best. I purchased a couple silicone bowls for mixing plaster. I really like them because 2 bowls would let me mix enough plaster for 10 to 12 castings. You can let the plaster that gets left in the bowls harden. Squeeze the bowls, dump out the remains, and you're ready for the next batch. I didn't do any precise measurement of the dry plaster to water. If it came out somewhere between pancake batter and peanut butter consistency, it was good. Well, the plaster I used, I got the local hardware store in 25-pound bags. After I did this scene, I decided to finish all the mountains and ended up going through 150 pounds of plaster for that part. But that's a story for another day. Again, I recommend Darryl Huffman's videos on the very thorough explanation of the process of painting backdrops. The process is start from far to near, farthest mountains first, progressing nearer and nearer. You might notice a few white colored areas. These are fun. You paint an area of white, let it dry. Then you go over the white area with foliage colors. While those are still wet, you run a palette knife through the wet paint to make the white trunks of the trees. Then a bit more foliage color to blend it all in. I put the two main structures in temporarily to get me a feel of how much sky versus hillside looked right. When I was finished, I was pleased with the result. And since I had everything handy, I went ahead and finished the backdrop painting on the rest of the layout. At this point of the project, I found the switch machine for the sidings had stopped working. The machine was in a tight space to begin with, and it took some surgery to remove and replace it. Once it was back in, it made an awkward section by the river. My solution was to build a retaining wall using stained bamboo skewers and some ground cover. I spent quite a bit of time trying to determine what colors to use on the castings. I had some photos of a trip to Silverton I did a few years ago and viewed photos online. I knew there would be a variety of colors and shades. To get a better handle on the coloring, I used scraps left over from the rock castings. I painted them with different base coats and then applied 3 different washes and mounted them to a cardboard for quick reference. I mixed some washes of the colors I wanted to use in disposable cups and brushed them on with cheap 1-inch brushes. I would hit spots with one of the colors and then go back with the others until the castings and the exposed plaster cloth were pretty much covered. I also had handy a couple of spray bottles of diluted black, burnt umber, and tan to help add variation and blend the colors. For the slopes needed between the castings, I thought I would use some scraps of plaster from the casting process. I have an old kitchen blender and I put some plaster scraps in it and ran it to break them up. Then I used various colors of washes to stain them. I tried adding them to the slope by painting the slope with diluted white glue, sprinkling the plaster bits over the top. It was okay, but not quite right. By chance, I had some play sand, the kind you use in a child's sandbox. I sprinkled that over the plaster bits and that helped. As I progressed to the other slopes, I would paint them with diluted glue and sprinkle on the sand. The sand had a variety of sizes of small stones that helped the look. Later on, when I was working on another area of the layout, I used a kitchen strainer to separate out the finer grains. This worked real well in a lot of areas, as well as ballasting the tracks. Another material that worked was taking a handful of dry leaves and grinding them in the blender. The veins of the leaves made for nice looking fallen branches. Time for some trees. I took photos of the remains of the mill area a few years ago on my trip, and the trees look pretty similar to others I have on the layout. I decided to stick with the florist wire and twine twisted trees. I made a jig a while back for making these. I have tried using an electric drill for twisting, but I like the hand crank that this one has. It gives me a bit more control. I would twist up about 20 to 25 trees, then paint them with brown spray paint. Once the paint was dried, I applied sprayed adhesive and sprinkled on foliage for leaves. At this point, I was feeling pretty good about myself, but that was short-lived. I did some switching at the mill and found out that some of the castings were projecting too far for the engines and cars to get by. So more rock surgery. I fussed with this longer than I should have. I pried off a couple castings and applied new ones. What I ended up with was an unnatural looking area. So again, I put a retaining wall in front of it and was happy with how that turned out. Moving closer to the foreground, I started working on the structures. If you look at the prototype photos, there are quite a few of them. I needed to decide which ones to feature. I went back to the mill structure to see if I could use my mock-up. I sanded it and applied covering of thin cardboard, and then I started cutting and applying sheet metal siding. I used small individual pieces on the sides you would see and larger pieces on the sides that would be hidden or very difficult to see. In the photos, I found there were structures connected to the top of the mill. I really enjoyed building this section with the various sizes and angles. I then got started on finishing the ore building and constructing the extension to that building. This building is part of a Campbell Scale Models wayside freight station kit that I modified. This one is an old freight station kit that I made on my first layout when I was in high school, so I wanted to find a way to use it. It ended up being the powerhouse for the complex. Here are the rest of the structures that are scratch built. Continuing forward, I next worked on the river bottom and a section between the layout edge and the track. I had purposely left that for the end as I was constantly reaching over the area and would have been damaging anything there during the build. I painted the river sides with diluted glue and applied sand and finer materials. Some of the stuff naturally fell down the river banks, so I left it there. For the water itself, I used a product called Ecopoxy. I had seen this product demonstrated at a woodworking seminar on making epoxy river tables. It's a two-part epoxy with very little smell. I purchased a 4-liter kit, and that was plenty for this river section. I'll be able to use it again on a larger section at some time in the future. I did multiple thin pours, and that blended together nicely. I also experimented with some whitewater effect that were a bit hit or miss, but ended up okay. With most of the major work done, next up were the details and blending in the scenery. For example, in this photo, I added trees to hide the right end of the river and to hide an awkward joint between two rock castings. Details will be an ongoing thing. I found in one photograph there were tram towers at the facility, so I built a couple. I'm depicting them as no longer in use, the tram buckets discarded at the base of the tower. I added some figures and a gantry crane and odds and ends of crates and barrels. As I said, this will be an ongoing, and it is fun to go to train shows to find details that will continue to be added to the scene. Wrapping up, this project took about 6 months as I worked on it as time allowed. It let me get more experience with various aspects of the hobby: backdrop painting, terrain forming, plaster casting, applying scenery materials, building structures, tree making, pouring a river, and adding details. Another aspect I enjoyed was finding old photographs and what it might have been like when this complex was in operation. Are there things that could have been better? Sure, but I'm very happy with how it turned out at the moment. I probably sweated the small stuff too much. What I'm most happy about is that when someone sees the scene, there's too much to take in at a glance. I want the viewer's eyes to be able to be drawn from one vignette to another. The painted backdrop, hills, and structures are all just background for the stars of the show, the trains.